So thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to everybody who's spoken so far. Thank you particularly to Audrey for a great introduction to the significance of Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy and politics and biography, really, being for the collective work that she and Mark have been doing in exploring the spatiality of Jean-Paul Sartre's concepts. Thank you to the master's students who spoke so effectively and movingly about Mark, and thank you to my masters and PhD students. And PhD students. And thank you to my colleagues for speaking in a tone ranging from the don't be an idiot to thank you very much to learn to act, or I think that's what the summary of the three interventions that we had just before our comfort break. So I said at the beginning that Mark's made an immense contribution to this university and to this department. And I said that most of those contributions are sort of almost taken for granted. His contributions as a teacher, as an administrator, as an academic citizen, as a mentor, as a support for students, as a sort of lightning rod for student enthusiasm, pulls it out of them and shows them that spark of creativity that they have. That they may not have already realised that they had. But I said that the thing that I thought often gets missed when people are talking about why everyone loves Mark Boyle, as the hashtag does, is his contribution as a scholar, and in particular the ethical, political tone of his work, going back to the early work on Sartrean dialectic as a way of understanding what's happening in Ballymun, through to the recent work about understanding colonial and post-colonial societies through the lens of the humanistic version of Marxism that Mark excavates from the 2 volumes of the Critique of Dialectical Reason by Sartre. And I wanted today to have a focus on Marx's scholarship. We can do a little bit more sobbing into our mind on another occasion, but I wanted to do something quite joyous and celebrate Mark's scholarly contribution. There's no better way of celebrating Mark's scholarly contribution than making him sing for his supper. Mark is going to give us one of his perspectives, one of his wonderful lectures. This time the title is Sartrean Geographies. This is the theme of the book that Audrey tells us is virtually done, and that Mark, in his Sartrean, Glaswegian, pessimistic style, as Joe described it, tells us is not yet there, not yet there. When it is there, it won't be any good, and all the rest of it. It will be a wonderful book. We're all looking forward to reading it, and we're also looking forward to enjoying this sneak preview. Before Mark speaks, I should say that the list of people who wrote to me said they couldn't be here and they wanted me to read messages from them. It would turn into something like almost like a best man speech at a wedding. Lots of your colleagues are currently teaching elsewhere on campus, and therefore they're not able to be here. There are also people who responded to the email notification that we sent out to the Irish Geographers list. I remember Frederick Harmony and the more Cherry, and there probably were others. So anyway, lots of people wanted to be here, and many people are here, and we're all looking forward to hearing about Sartrean geographies. So thank you very much, Mark.
Well, for Charlie's benefit, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Can I just begin, coming from the west of Scotland, I actually have never felt more west of Scotland than this afternoon. I feel absolutely overwhelmed, and from the bottom of my heart, I appreciate everyone who's come and spoke today. Jerry for organising the session, Audrey for doing something which obviously means anything thereafter is going to be by definition inferior. I'm absolutely in debt to these people for the quality and integrity of their collegiality, I suppose. Mixed also though with the West of Scotland black effrontery and mortification at some of the comments that's been made. And you know, I do think that Adrian mentioned obviously Dennis earlier, the people that built up the geography department here certainly precede me and Jim was central to that, and we have come subsequently a small brick in the wall, but we have tried our best to contribute, but certainly we don't deserve days like this, so I'm especially appreciative because I think it's in many ways an ill-deserved afternoon. So, with that, let me make sure that Rob changes his mind and chases me out the door after hearing everything that I've got to say. Beginning where Audrey left off, because this is the most common question that myself and Audrey get at conferences, and from family, that has to be said. Why Sartre, why now? Now that's a polite version of what people would pitch to us. And there is this sense that from Foucault, I suppose, onwards, Sartre was obsolete, a 20th century thinker, someone whose ideas bore the traces of intellectual thought that is now passé and certainly been eclipsed by much more contemporary forms of philosophy and social theory. So there is a question of why go back to a 20th century philosopher, why go back to a 20th century social theorist, when trying to make sense of this 21st century and all of the complex geopolitics that Audrey referred to earlier, from Trump and from Brexit onwards. What has this person got to say to the world in which we are living today? And I have to say, for reasons that have been mentioned so far, from the early 1980s, when I first started reading Nausea, which was Sartre's first novel, I quickly felt a sense of affiliation, a sense of connection, a sense of fascination with the work of this person, this scholar. Perhaps it's because he's 5'1". Perhaps I felt this would be the one philosopher I could possibly take in a boxing match. Perhaps it's because he's reputed to be the ugliest of all of the 20th century philosophers. Perhaps it's because he overdosed regularly on Coradrine, a pain-killing drug, with excess coffee and brandy in excess proportions. Perhaps for all of those reasons, this particular individual resonates with life choices that I've been known to make periodically. But for me, it's his ontology. It's his understanding of how the world works and his sense of explanation as to how the world unfolds through time as it does. And for me, that ontology, even though it is rooted in 1950s, 1960s Parisian intellectual life, 20th century decolonisation, French, Algerian geopolitics, it still is an ontology which I think has remained super relevant in trying to make sense of the world and how it works today. Sartre, in the end, developed a dialectical method, and dialectics is probably a bit passé now as well, it's unfashionable. But of course we know that there are strains and strands and complex varieties of dialectical reasoning and dialectical methodology. And I think that the dialectic which Sartre ended up espousing, actually by dint of intellectual failure, Sartre never finished his key works, in fact he hardly finished any work, but in that failure I think he discovered, perhaps somewhat accidentally, a form of dialectical reasoning which I think gives us the start of an ontology which is extremely relevant to 21st century political conditions. So I want to say today a little bit about this ontology and why I think it's something to say for making sense of, and as he would put it, rendering intelligible the world in which we live now. Sartre's three works, and of course he wrote a lot of fiction, poetry, plays, literature. Fiction, he won the Nobel Prize for The Road to Freedom, a trilogy. Of course he refused that on the grounds that it was a bourgeois celebration. But Sartre's three key philosophical works, or three key works that are referred to as his, if you like, fulcrum points for the development of his thinking. Well, first of all, Being in Nothingness, published in 1946, which stands still to this day as the main statement on existentialism, the most elaborate development of ideas around existentialism. Believe it or not, it's Sartre and not Woody Allen that coined existentialism. From 1946, he then goes on to write the Critique of Dialectical Reason, which is what I really want to drill down into. It's his attempt to bring humanism, existentialism into conversation with then the forms of Marxism that were swirling in Paris in the 1950s and 1960s. It came in 2 volumes and it was never completed. He was unable to synthesize or bring into effect a meaningful conversation between his earlier existentialism and his more later commitment to Marxism. But in that failure, I think myself and Audrey see the architecture of an ontology, which we think is actually probably more impressive than what he was trying to achieve in reality. And finally, in 1980, where he swings away from Marxism initially to anarchism, and then eventually in a controversial conversion to Judaism. Of course, he had roots in the Jewish faith, but remained an atheist, a dogmatic atheist for much of his life. But a series of interviews with Benny Levy, controversial interviews towards the end of his life, Sartre was supposedly converted back to Judaism and back to the Old Testament as a kind of socio-political, eschatological notion of how the world should be unfolding. By that stage, Sartre was blind and feeble, and de Beauvoir and many of Sartre's friends were very critical of Levy, claiming that he had bullied him into these interviews, he misunderstood his words, and he had actually foisted onto Sartrean thought a kind of late twist that was never properly there for Sartre. Although Sartre did affirm the validity of Hope Now, although many people questioned the state of mind he was in when he was making that affirmation. Being in Nothingness develops the idea of human freedom in situation. And it's always for Sartre in situation. So Sartre was never a Cartesian philosopher, as many people believe him to have been. He was always understanding consciousness as rooted in and through the situations in which people found themselves. And of course, he was interested in the way in which objectifications, the look, as he referred to it, often resulted in people fleeing into bad faith, the condition in which people live inauthentic existence, don't exercise choice, don't exercise their freedom, don't choose to live authentically because they fear the radical vertigo or the nausea, as he refers it, or as I suppose the bad nerves that come through speaking one's mind, irrespective of the consequences. And he's believed very pessimistically that bad faith more than freedom was the essential human condition. That people often fled into bad faith, allowed themselves to make choices that actually were not their own choices, allowed themselves to be objectified by the look of others, and lived by and large insincere lives, punctuated only with exercises of freedom, authentic modes of existence in the very small moments in which we courted nausea, courted vertigo. quoted that dread of the absurdity of human existence and realised that it's up to us to choose. Sartre talked about ethics as being popping up like partridges. There were no foundations for ethical existence. Ethics had to be created by human beings, and there were no a priori ethical frameworks that could help us understand how to live ethically. We had to choose. And in that choice, of course, nausea, the sense of being sick to the pit of one's stomach about the fact that one has full freedom to make that choice, is such an existentially angst-driven condition that it's something that we attempt to flee from. So the book classically had a pessimistic tone, even though it was a book about human freedom in situation and an espousal of human freedom as being essential to the human condition. As Sartre moved into the 50s and 60s, he began to take more seriously the situation bit of human freedom in situation, and began to understand the social and political worlds in which people found themselves. Ronald Aronson very persistently tracks a biography of Sartre between Being in Nothingness and the Critique, and says, in slow, definitive stages between 1940 and 1957, Sartre first became committed to political activism, to socialism, to developing an integration of thought, writing and action, to building a non-communist democratic social movement, to building close relations with the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, to using Marxism as a tool of analysis, and then, in search for a method, which was a preface to the Critique of Dialectical Reason, to Marxism full-blown as a philosophy. And he was often dubbed the ultra-Bolshevik, so convinced was his embrace of Marxism in this period. But Sartre, stung by critiques from his friends, particularly Maurice Merleau-Ponty, that he was defaulting to some structural Marxism where human beings had very little say under the kind of path of capitalism that was destined to unfold in a kind of teleological way, and that human beings were cogs in a machine that would simply run its course. Sartre, in response to that, and drawing upon French existential Marxism, that tradition that was trying to write humans back into the Marxist canon in French intellectual life, Parisian intellectual life in the 1950s and 60s, decided that he was going to rescue Marxism from this structural overdetermination and to write existentialism as the essential foundation for understanding how history unfolds. One could not understand how history unfolds without understanding human alienation in situation and how human beings cope with, deal with that existential condition. He wrote this book, and I'll say a little bit more about the specifics in just a second. But he wrote this book in an effort to put right by then his disregard for the Soviet Union, which under Stalin had ossified, in his view, from a liberation movement into a crippling and monstrous bureaucracy. And his notion was that Marxism could be saved and salvaged from the Soviet experiment, which he perceived to be a perverted detour from authentic Marxism. He believed the Soviet Union wasn't a sign of the failure of Marxism, more generally it was simply a perverted cul-de-sac that one malignant strand of Marxism had unwittingly progressed into. And he believed that by bringing existentialism and Marxism back into conversation, it would be possible to rescue an authentic Marxism and found Marxism in much more progressive and lasting, enduring principles. So very briefly, before I talk about the work myself and Audrey have been doing, Sartre's efforts to found a new breed of Marxism, the transition from capitalist society to some post-capitalist communist society with human alienation as being the motor course of that historical development. it resulted in a whole vocabulary. And many people struggle with this critique of dialectical reason. He wrote it under tremendous strain. He wrote it when he was popping 40, 50, 60 painkillers each day in a burst that de Beauvoir describes as being frenetic and frantic. Chaotic writing, but inventing a whole language which he articulated with what people call Mandarin fluency. So you connect with the language, and it takes you a while to get into the terminology he uses, and then once you've connected with that vocabulary, it's a very lucid text, a very readable text thereafter. But one has to socialise oneself into Sartre's vocabulary, which, being the product of 50 and 60 painkillers, at times was slightly wide of the mark. Sartre positions scarcity as a key concept in the whole effort to rescue Marxism. And of course, scarcity was a dirty word in the Marxist canon, a bourgeois word, a word Adam Smith had been using to found his own branch of liberal economics. And of course, within the Marxist canon, Malthusian understandings of scarcity and the importance of scarcity in historical processes was something that was scorned upon. Sartre tries to argue that scarcity is, at one level, a universal human condition. There are simply not enough to go around. But because there is simply not enough to go around, Sartre argues that societies create resource allocation mechanisms, or mechanisms of distributing and rationing scarce resources. And it's in those contingent scarcities, so those historical scarcities, or in those milieu of scarcity, as he refers to, worlds of scarcity, which are historically and geographically specific and humanly created, that he thinks one finds the secret of the engine of history, what drives history forward. How do human beings deal with being in particular milieus of scarcity? How do we cope with living in scarcity? And Sartre goes back to his pessimistic view that by and large we cope with scarcity by trying to jockey ourselves into a position in particular systems of resource rationing, and thereafter we line up in series. And he calls that existence where we simply put our heads down and try to survive in particular regimes of resource distribution as seriality, as a condition of living an existence which is alienating, simply because we are paws up, eyes down, as Sartre says. He calls this mode of existence the dominant human condition. It's the forms of bad faith now that he develops under Marxism. Bad faith now becomes seriality, living as one is objectified by systems of resource allocation that one is living in. And he calls this type of existence a plurality of solitudes. Sartre always gives small examples, and Audrey mentioned boxing earlier on, but the example he uses, which he says is at once pithy and trivial, whilst at the same time being profound and deep, is people waiting for a bus in a Parisian street in a cold winter's morning, and the bus coming with insufficient spaces. One objectifies the other in spite of one's best principles to stand and miss work or wait, and it becomes a struggle over that finite number of bus seats. An example which is trivial, and we can all think we can rise above it, but at the same time goes to a punishing truth about the human condition and about what makes us react, as one knows, when lining up for a Ryanair flight and waiting for one's pass to the back seat. But Sartre does say that this moment of scarcity, of seriality, is punctured historically when people are alienated sufficiently. They realise that this condition is no way to live an authentic human life, that they burst forth into a sense of sociality, a sense of mutuality, a sense of reciprocity, and a sense that we don't have to live under the constraints of this resource regime. And this resource regime is actually undercutting our shared humanity. Sartre calls these moments, as Joe mentioned earlier, the group infusion. And they're moments when hope exists, when there's an exhilarating sense of what's possible. And for Sartre, the storming of the Bastille is the cherished example of a moment when intolerable milieux of scarcity gave rise to a movement which was anarchic, chaotic, which burst through and pierced through the dominant rationing of resources, and which for a moment and thereafter gave fleeting hope that one could live authentically. Sartre says, and this is the key issue he had, that those groups totalize, as all those individuals living in serialized existence coalesce into tributaries, and he used kind of fluvial geomorphology metaphors here, that there is no way to predict where that might end up. And these emergent, novel, hybridized liberation movements, coalescing, totalizing, scaling up, he refers to as groups in fusion that emerge through third parties. As third parties join two groups together into some hybridized third resistance movement that then further upstream joins into further groups as further third parties totalizing those tributaries until one gets an entire alluvial fan of opposition, the storming of the Bastille. For Sartre, being pessimistic, thinking bad faith and human alienation is what we're destined always to struggle to resist but very rarely do, groups in fusion either abort or petrify before they can reach any meaningful social change. So they come, pop up, but they just don't have the organisation or don't have the sustenance or the resilience to change the system. And so you get these ephemeral groups in fusion that dissolve no sooner than they are created. Or one gets those groups in fusion growing, organising in order to survive, you have to organise, but in so organising, bureaucratising, and turning themselves into crippling monstrosities, Stalinism, the Soviet Union. And so for Sartre, the group infusion really was the politics which he ended up espousing. The notion that we would arrive at a destination, communism, gave way to the notion that there is no destination, that resistance and struggle is the most that human beings can hope to cope with. A very disappointing outcome for people who read the book, looking for hope, that there is only struggle, there is nothing to be destined to end up with, but nonetheless something which departs Sartre from Marxism, because now, in his attempt to found a new Marxist understanding, there is no teleology, there is no direction, there is no sense that we're on the march to somewhere new or somewhere different. There are only these small guerrilla warfare tactics on milieus of scarcity, which periodically create exhilarating journeys of hope, but which journeys either end up very quickly by dissolving or petrifying, or growing into something which is just as oppressive as the system in which one was trying to overturn in the first instance. So, why might that anthology be something myself and Audrey and others might think is useful? Well, we're I suppose finish maybe 10 minutes or so with signposting some of the work that myself and Audrey have done. And the truth of the matter is that we have realised that ontology at different geographical scales, in different ways, over different topics. And so, in a sense, it's an expression, these projects are an expression of ways in which we see something happening out in the world. And we think that Sartre's understanding of how the world works provides a particularly punishing insight into that process. So it is a little scattered, geographically variegated our topics. The book is an attempt, I suppose, to bring them together and to put some overarching shape upon them. I do think we are, myself and Audrey have spoken about this, one of the few social scientists that try to give empirical material and try to use Sartre empirically. Very few people, for reasons that they think these ideas are too abstract to realise empirically, venture into this territory. But for us, if you can't apply to make sense of the world meaningfully around you, then what is the point, what is the purpose, especially given the activism that flows naturally from this kind of political proclivity to groups and fusion. So the first project was edited very tightly by an editor, very, very tightly, but thankfully for the benefit of the paper, was a paper that I wrote actually when Rob invited me over in 2003, 2004 to be a visiting fellow over in Nursa. At the time, it was my first visit to Maynooth. And I was given the opportunity of working in Ballymun in the spring and summer of 2003. And for me, this estate and the dehumanising effects of being caught up in this abstract space of 1960s modernist brutalised planning, and the way in which human beings were trying to create colour, life, add humanity, survive, have dignified existences, have authentic existences, live with respect, live with a sense of integrity, was an enormous theme, something that impressed me hugely. I saw the estate in terms of the imposition of serialised existence, a plurality of solitudes, brutalised resource allocation models in Dublin City Council, a milieu of scarcity, in which, for the most part, people lived serialised lives, but nonetheless there was clear evidence throughout anywhere that one looks in Ballymun of people in a desperate quest for dignity, resourceful people, capable people, people who had been dealt life circumstances and ended up in an environment which turned out to be an environment that was very inhospitable to human flourishing, but nonetheless which flourished remarkably against the odds in that environment. And I could see that the regeneration strategy, which promised so much more, it would bulldoze the old Ballymun down and create new Ballymun, was nothing more than a new milieu of scarcity, and nothing more than another serialised landscape that was destined to dehumanise the population. And as one sees, no matter what one talks about the community consultation and the community was going to be involved in decision making and so on in Ballymun, Ballymun has been torn down. The recession is clearly mitigated against its regeneration. But what's gone up is really not much better than what was there originally. And there are more serialised people. The community's been destroyed. There are less human flourishing, it seems to me, in the Ballymun of today, the regenerated Ballymun, as there was in the older Ballymun, where people formed into these primitive, small groups in fusion, fleeting existences. But for Sartre and for myself, groups in fusion, which meant everything to them, struggle was everything to them. It didn't result in an estate which empowered them, it gave them ownership, it didn't result in a new Ballymun that changed the world. It was just a new milieu of scarcity that was visited upon them. But in the old Ballymun, that sense of human flourishing, of human dignity, of human survival, meant everything to that population, as it did to Sartre. Very primitive, localised, many small groups in fusion, which often petrified before they grew into anything meaningful. Myself and Audrey then published a paper in the Transactions in 2011, and we tried to look at Sartre's work now on colonialism. If Sartre thought that the Soviet Union was a perversion of Marxism, then he believed that authentic Marxism, the true heirs of Marxism, would spring forth in the colonies. And Sartre wrote more and done most of his activism in the colonies than I think most activist scholars at this time, simply because he believed that the colonies were where the action was going to be happening, and that decolonisation, which was unfolding round about him in the 50s and 60s as the independence movement grew in stride, the negritude movement grew in force, tricontinentalism, the uniting of Latin America, Asia, Africa into a post-colonial future was unfolding round about Sartre. Sartre was fascinated by the potential of the colonies, but also colonialism as the progenitor of fundamental milieus of global scarcity, the way in which resources were distributed fundamentally for the last 500 years have been through the machine of global colonialism. He visited Cuba. He was an ardent critique of the Vietnam War, which I'll mention briefly. Of course, he was interned in the Nazi prisoner of war camp, where he wrote large sections of Being Nothingness in the 1940s. But it was really in his opposition to French involvement in Algeria and his support of the rather violent tactics employed by the FLN, the independence movement in Algeria, that Sartre's anti-colonial works came to fruition. Now we, in this paper, we're trying to argue that many people, including Frantz Fanon, thought that Sartre, in spite of his best interests, was a metropolitan scholar who was prone to particular forms of theory, modernist universal theory. And Sartre understood the colonies through Marxism and wasn't sufficiently attentive to local variations or local understandings, in particular concrete anti-colonialisms and particular concrete circumstances of early independence and post-colonialism. And what we were trying to do in this paper were to say it is wrong to say that Sartre was a well-meaning, but in the end, middle-class, bourgeois, metropolitan, colonial scholar who unwittingly was employing Western-centric ideas and colonial epistemology to make sense of something which they had no business in getting involved in, other people's struggles, other people's work. And our argument was that Sartre was unable, because he was unable to bring existentialism and Marxism to bear. He aborted his work finished before he could do it, and he says, I can't effect a synthesis that allows us to get to where Marxism wants us to get us to intellectually. I can't bring existentialism and Marxism into conversation in order to make Marxism go in a particular historical direction. And we said that actually we think he was more complex, more nuanced. We wouldn't go as far as to say he was provincialising Western ideas and theories of colonialism, but he certainly had more nuanced understandings and wasn't painting colonialism as histories with the kind of blunt brush or the broad brush that his critics had suggested. So this is a theoretical paper, I suppose, trying to look at what we call metropolitan anxieties and to challenge the idea that Sartre preferred modes of theorising colonialism were deeply Western. And we argued that Sartre's quirky. His ideas are unclassifiable. His ideas are complex and often tortuous and contradictory, and one cannot simply write him off as a well-meaning but redundant Western scholar. Very quickly, this was a book we contributed. Audrey wrote involved in this chapter, a brilliant chapter on Sartre's relationships with Fanon, Frantz Fanon. Sartre wrote the preface, as Audrey says, to the Wretched of the Earth, the most famous anti-colonial Bible, I suppose. And Fanon was a psychiatrist in Algeria, originally born in Martinique, but who had spent time in France training as a psychiatrist and went to Algeria to understand the psychiatric malaise and melancholy that surrounds populations that are brutally colonised and brutally suppressed. And he very much was Sartrean in his inspiration. Sartre's existential psychoanalysis was very much the method that Fanon used in this particular book. Fanon died of pancreatic cancer in the middle of the Algerian War of Independence, but months before his death, he marched to the front line to FLN troops, FLN resistance fighters, with early drafts of the Critique of Dialectical Reason, and was lecturing and tutoring them on the necessity of understanding this book in order to understand their historical mission. At times, I think they would have preferred some guns and some tanks, perhaps. And, the Critique of Dialectical Reason was thick, and it perhaps provided them with some protection, but perhaps wasn't what they were looking for. But nonetheless, Sartre, as he did with so many relationships, had fractures falling out and so on. And he fell out with Fanon on a whole variety of different reasons, for a whole variety of different purposes, although they remained kindred spirits. They ultimately had a falling out over their understanding of the anti-racist racism that Sartre often believed existed within anti-colonial movements. They done it to us, so we'll do it to them. For Sartre, that was an abhorrence. And anti-colonial movements had to set higher standards. Couldn't be racist back against the European oppressors. Otherwise, that just perpetuated racism, anti-racist racism. And one had to move beyond that. Fanon was much more interested in critiques of Europe, much more interested in nationalist movements, much more interested in religious movements. Sartre was much more interested in authentic, universal freedoms and human conditions. I'm not going to talk about that. Talk about two more, then we'll finish. Paper we recently wrote, which tackled a different topic altogether, published in the Violent Planning D 2015. And this paper tried to look at what we know in the North in the context of the Bloody Sunday tribunals, which is how come it is the case that imperial justice is not perceived to be justice meaningfully in colonised countries or countries that have been subject to colonisation. Our justice isn't perceived by others to be a just justice, and it's for that reason that the International War Crimes Tribunal has very few signatories, limited signatories, from parts of the global south. America, the United States also is not a signatory to the ICC. But it's because countries, even middle-income countries, perceive Western modes of justice, Western tribunals, as being deeply Western-centric. Why is George Bush and Tony Blair not charged for war crimes tribunal when people who done heinous acts, but acts no worse than them, are brought to justice? And it's not just the case that Western power is more muscular, and therefore the West would never touch Western leaders, but would find no problem in sanctioning leaders in the global south. We argued that what's intrinsic here is there's actually Western concepts of justice. It's an epistemic issue. It's what the West perceives to be a just justice. It's the very ideas of justice that fails to connect with people who are subject to colonial oppression. And we looked at Sartre's work in the Russell Tribunal, which charged America and found them guilty of war crimes tribunals in Vietnam, in Stockholm and London in the late 1960s, which Sartre presided over, to look at this idea of what would a non-universal, a non-Western form of justice look like. For Sartre, it had to be relativist, it had to be rooted in context, always in situation. So there was no universal justice. Ethics appears like partridges, remember. So it had to appear in situation, but nonetheless it had to be reasoned also. It was a non-foundational, rational form of justice. It was justice that made sense and could be argued. Reasons have to be given, and those reasons have to appear to be compelling in a particular historical context. So we wrote that paper, and I think still we have a bit of work to do in the archives to really flesh out Sartre's unique idea of what post-colonial ethics might look like, and what a non-Western, but also a non-foundational, non-relativist type of ethics might look like. And finally, thank God, I hear you say, get that guy to Liverpool. Move on then. Finally, a paper that myself, Audrey, and Rory Hearn are currently writing, it's under review in GEO Forum, is to theorise the Irish water movement as emerging in a very particular milieu of scarcity, austerity in Ireland from 2008-2009 onwards. And to try to look at how this was a group infusion that started in communities. After all, this wasn't a top-down oppositional movement. It blossomed and burst through communities all throughout Ireland and states and in housing estates resisting water meters. And through a series of third parties, those tributaries began to scale and to totalize into what became an unprecedented form of resistance that has weakened the resolve of the Irish state to maintain austerity, and certainly it's had a major effect on the political landscape. Being pessimistic, being Sartrean, one might say that it was a group infusion which is petrified and dissolved, and the lasting effects of the Irish water movement are not going to be sustainable. It's a classic flash group infusion that when it was there was tremendously empowering for all of us who'd been suffering for austerity for so long. And so it was freedom and struggle, authentic resistance for a bit, but we've defaulted back into now a righteous coalition, and it's likely to be a righteous coalition for some time. Others say that the water movement itself perhaps bureaucratised at times into something that was quite oppressive. And the Anti-Austerity Alliance and the fractions and within that and so on, it's clear that people who participated in some of those are themselves finding that perhaps, far from being a crippling monstrosity, but what they resisted to organise, to get structure, to survive, has become something different from that upwelling of mass, spontaneous grassroots mobilisation, which people referred to before. So the last slide is to say, before I finish, is to say thanks again. I've got this weird Donald Trump thing going on, you just excuse me, the fingers. For some reason, there's something not quite right with the body language that I'm ill at ease with, but I'm working on it. But to thank Jerry for organising today. As I said earlier on, ill-deserved, absolutely ill-deserved. Brick in the wall is the absolute accurate description of my time here in Maynooth. To Audrey for being an excellent, editor, fantastic editor to start with, a tremendous colleague, and it's been an unbelievable privilege for me to have somebody like yourself give me the time of day, let alone collaborate with me. So thanks very much for that. For the speakers today, I really appreciate your time. I see some people up from other places, really appreciate you making the effort to come down more over and above the call of duty. I'm not going to say much more because I will offend people who haven't mentioned, so generic thank you. And I will be around between now and January, so I'm not gone altogether. Of course, I'll make a nuisance of myself. Jerry has indicated to come back whenever I'm free drop in, but you will regret that when I am literally back every other week dropping in. So I just want to finish with Edward Said's comments on Sartre. Said, of course, was hugely influenced by Sartre. Orientalism is nothing else. An example of Western rejections and objectifications on colonised others. Said was deeply disappointed in the one meeting he had with Sartre, when he visited Sartre to talk about the Arab-Israeli situation, a meeting that Audrey often recounts in Foucault's flat in Paris, where Said arrived. Foucault excused himself, and it sounds just like my house in some regards, people coming and going in a kind of random way, musing over the big issues of the day. Sartre at that point, his eyesight was deteriorating, blindness was near. Of course, he eventually died in 1980, shortly after this meeting, and Said describes a feeble and frail figure, but only to recount the 80,000 that were lining the streets of Paris in Sartre's funeral in 1980, to understand that perhaps he caught the worst of the man. And he says, for my generation, he has always been one of the great intellectual heroes of the 20th century, a man whose insight and intellectual gifts were at the service of nearly every progressive cause of our time, yet he seemed neither fallible nor prophetic. On the contrary, one admires Sartre for the efforts he made to understand situations and, when necessary, to offer solidarity for political causes. He was never condescending or evasive, even if he was given to error and overstatement. Nearly everything he wrote is interesting for its sheer audacity, its freedom, including its freedom to be verbose, and its generosity of spirit. And I think it's for that reason why Sartre, why now, seems to me a redundant question.